Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So, the gospel reading today, which is the second of the two gospel readings that are offered, is another story about Jesus healing someone. And if you've ever paid attention in church before, I won't ask for a show of hands, there are a lot of those kinds of healing stories in the Gospels. But I have to say this one stands out as particularly a meaningful one for me. Now, I do realize that I am a minister and that I have to say all the Gospel stories are good stories, and I do certainly believe that. But some of them really stick to the soul in a special kind of way, especially depending on where you are in life. It may be that this one stuck with me because I was kind of sick for most of the last week, and this story is about a healing, so I guess it had a special kind of appeal. But I gotta say that the assurances offered in this gospel story are actually pretty deep, because this story assures us that whatever situation in which we may find ourselves, Jesus sees our struggle. And even more than that, Jesus knows the stories of our struggles. And thanks be to God, Jesus is there to offer us all a chance to be made well, to take those stories of struggle and turn them into anthems for the glory of God, if only we will give our lives over to Jesus and let the Lord do his work in us. So the gospel story begins just after Jesus does some healing in one place and then comes to a new place, a place that is famous for healing, a place called Bethzatha. Now, this was a place where people would go and wait for a pool of water to be stirred up. And once that happened, they would go inside and hope to be healed of their afflictions. And these afflictions would range from any host of things. And now here we have Jesus coming to this pool as well. And when he gets there, he sees that in all 5 porticos there are people who are sick, there are people with disabilities, then they are lying by the water that is supposed to heal. They're waiting, they're hoping for some kind of deliverance or some kind of mercy, some kind of healing or some kind of change in life that will make things easier. And when Jesus gets there, he sees the need, he sees the desperation, he sees the hope, and he sees the faith that brought all of them to this pool. Now, I know all of us at some point have been by a pool in life like that before. Remember now, this pool was in the temple precinct. That means it's the same neighborhood as the temple. There should have been lots of people there to help these folks out, but there's really no mention of able-bodied or well or folks that are doing okay helping the desperate and the destitute and those in need. There's no mention of able-bodied folks here there praying for the needy and asking the needy to pray for them. Jesus is the only rabbi around willing to teach people the ways and wonders of God in this scenario. And just as much as Jesus saw the desperation and the hope and the faith of the sick and the troubled there, believe you me, he saw just as clearly who wasn't there. And let me tell you, that said something about their faith and their hope and their priorities too. So lying there among the desperate and the hopeful was one man who stood out in particular to Jesus, whom Jesus noticed more than the others. Jesus looked upon him and knew that the man had been ill for 38 years. 38 years he suffered disability and pain. 38 years he had suffered life in the gutter and the margins of that society, ignored and mocked and taken advantage of and condescended to, not treated like he was a full person because he was different. 38 years of being kept from regular society where people came and went as they pleased and had no time for people like him who were at the mercy and kindness of others. Jesus saw this man and he knew this man's struggle. Now this is a message of hope for all of us, folks. It's not just that Jesus sees, it's that Jesus knows. He knows the stories of people. He knows the stories of all people. So when you worry that perhaps no one knows your pain or your struggle, when you're worried that no one knows the depth of the bitter tears that you have wept and the sleepless nights that you have endured in your most trying times, when you're worried that no one knows your troubles or your trials or your tribulations, the ways in which you've been tossed about or tossed aside or made to feel ignored or put down, you do not need to worry for long. Jesus sees you. He sees all of us lying in the portico, hoping for healing, and Jesus knows us all. He knows our pains, he knows our wounds, he knows our struggles. Unfortunately for us, Jesus doesn't just see and know our pains, he offers us a chance to be made well. In the story with the sick man, Jesus looks at this man who has been sick for 38 years and has been lying by a portico by the pool for a very long time and asks him why he hasn't entered the waters. "Do you not wish to be made well?" Jesus asks him. The man's response is a kind of surprising one. Jesus asks him kind of a yes or no question. Do you want to be well or not? And this guy doesn't say yes or no. He says that he hasn't been made well because when the waters are stirred up and the healing properties are activated, he has no one there to help him into the water. He can't walk due to his illness, and the other folks who come to be healed, no one out of that whole group, no one, not a single person in 38 years has bothered to help this man get in the water when he needed it. They just walked past him or walked over him like some stampeding herd to get what they want. They trample over the most needy and the ill. They ignore the most desperate or the destitute, the crowds who believe in the healing power of the waters, who have come to the neighborhood of the temple to get this healing for themselves, push their way past this man to heal themselves and then leave. Now, I'd like to say that things aren't like that these days, but let me tell you, the notion of every man for himself or looking out for number one hasn't really gone anywhere. And it's just as much a problem now as it was back then. You see, I know that there are stories of individuals who serve others so selflessly, and there are even more people who serve than there are stories to tell about it. There are secret, silent saints who go about doing good works of great compassion and mercy, and you'd never know it. Amen. But there are also a lot of people who are just looking out for number one. There are a lot of people who want to get theirs and go home and do it no matter what it takes. And sometimes we have those moments ourselves. But this brings me back to a point I made earlier. Jesus sees the secret saints of the gospel and their good work. And Jesus also sees those who are part of the masses, walking all over and right by others in need. And he also sees the needy, the wounded, the sick. And let me tell you, that is all of us at some point or another. Jesus sees all of us in these moments and asks us the same question that he asked the man in this story. Do you not wish to be made well? This is another way of Jesus asking us if we want salvation. You see, because sin is the fracture of our relationship with God, one another, ourselves, or the rest of creation. So salvation is healing of that wound that we caused. Do you not wish to be made well? Jesus asks us. Jesus asks all of us who lie sick and desperate in the portico just outside the pool. You could answer that a simple yes or no, but I don't think I'd recommend that always. The man in the gospel responded to Jesus' question by telling Jesus his story. So don't be afraid to lay your troubles on Jesus. Amen? Amen. Don't be afraid to answer Jesus' call to salvation with the story of your life, of your troubles and trials, of your joys and your triumphs. Give him everything and tell him the whole story. Amen? He knows it already, but when you tell him that story, you are giving it to him. When you do that, you are making it part of his story. You're making that free choice to make him Lord of your life, author of your story. You're inviting him to come into your life and laugh and cry and hurt and heal with you. Don't be afraid to lay that on the Lord, and don't be afraid to tell the story of how the Lord has helped you through. Amen? And don't be afraid to be a person unlike the people in that crowd and actually be like Jesus, helping those that need it. Because you should. Because they matter. And one day, you'll need help too. And you'll wish that there was somebody there who acted more like Jesus and less like the crowds. So after that man tells Jesus his story, Jesus does not go and stir up the waters for him. He just tells the man to stand up and he's healed instantly. He stood up, took his mat, and he walked away. You'll notice that the gospel segment today ends with a little sentence that says, "This day was the Sabbath." Now that's an important setup for what happens next that isn't included today. as now the healed man is walking and he runs into some people who get onto him for carrying a mat on the Sabbath, because back then that was working on the Sabbath and that violated the religious rules. And then after those people find out what happened, they get upset because somebody was healing on the Sabbath, and that violated their religious rules. They were so focused on trying to honor God that they were insulting the very work of God in their midst, because it didn't fit into how they'd always done things or how they imagined God only worked. Now I ask you, where were these people when this man was lying on the portico 6 other days a week that weren't the Sabbath and needed to be healed? I don't know, but they were there to complain about something there at the end. All of us have this tendency at some point. You see, this story is partly about people who need something being ignored by others who theoretically want to be godly but end up being so misguided that they don't see the exciting ways in which God is working right in front of them, and they miss opportunities to be good spiritual people in their everyday lives. They're missing a connection with God that they want to serve because they've turned religion into a tradition, a custom, an idol. And they care more about that than the free Spirit of God sweeping across the land. Now, I'm not saying to turn church into a free-for-all, and I'm not saying to abandon all our traditions. What I am saying here is that you've got to be careful not to miss the forest for the trees when it comes to this stuff. You've got to be careful not to get so distracted and caught up in the minor things that we miss the big stuff. When we walk right past the person in need, we walk right past God in our very midst. When we shun a person who's testifying to the glory of God in their lives because they do it a little differently, we shun the Spirit of the living God. So today, I call on us all, myself included, to start being more mindful of how it is that this gospel story has told us the Lord works in our world today. I pray that our eyes sharpen to the needs of others so that we don't just move right by them. And I also pray that we will be more like the man who lays his struggles on the Lord and then lets Jesus work in his life. I pray that we will be like that healed man, taking up our mat and being strong, letting our lives testify to the glory of God. And like that healed man, I pray that our lips testify to the good things God has done and the good things God is doing right here at St. Cyprian's. God is the living water in the portico, the giver of grace and power, the balm in Gilead that will heal us all. And I say we join Jesus in that good work. Amen.
Amen.